This is narrative medicine, and what we're going to talk about today is the therapeutic use of narrative medicine for patients who have functional seizures. So first of all, just a few words about narrative medicine itself, that it draws out the patient's entire narrative of illness or injury in the context of the whole life story of the patient. In many cases, the patients, especially those who have this particular condition, may have grown up in a culture of silence. We don't talk about those things. And many of the patients who have these issues have had a traumatic history or a sense of having been overwhelmed, um, having been faced with situations that were beyond what they could cope with, but at the same time unable to talk about. So narrative medicine seeks to draw out the patient's illness narrative, the whole story from the beginning, the earliest point, through attempts at treatment that may have failed up to the present day. So it invites the patient to put significant experiences into words. It builds a bridge with the patient who may never have been given the opportunity to discuss such matters before. It allows dialogue, unstated or silenced concerns may be given voice, put into words, new insights discovered. It gives the patient an opportunity to explore their thoughts and feelings in ways they may never have been able to previously. It may also include written responses by patients to writing prompts, discussion in journal workshop groups, or discussion of patient writings with a narrative medicine provider. In other words, this can be done in a group context as well as a one-on-one context. It may involve work by the patient independently of the narrative medicine provider as the patient engages in journal writing, journal exercises, or homework, if you will, that lets them reflect privately about these matters of special concern. The narrative medicine session invites the patient to participate in a very important professional relationship. Rita Charon describes it as dyadic, that is to say, patient-provider, the one who tells and the one who listens. And this is not just an interview, it is not just a seeking of information, although lots of information may be disclosed, but it's actually a building of a relationship of trust that can be transformational, first and primarily for the one who tells the patient, but the one who listens, the one who participates with the patient is also involved in a transformative process that may touch them as well. That is Jung, I believe it was, who said we may have full knowledge of the principles and practices and procedures, but when we come close enough to touch the very person of the other, it's a person engaging another person. And that's a very important understanding with this, that we're building a relationship of trust. And that's so important in the context of this particular condition, where many of the patients involved have had repeated betrayals of trust, have been told that their condition doesn't matter, or they're making it up, or they shouldn't talk about such things. So to build a relationship of trust where these matters can be explored is very, very important. The sessions themselves are flexible, dynamic, and interactive. They may take unexpected turns. The narrative medicine process is not manualized. It's not merely going through a list of questions. There is no checklist. It's not formulaic. There's no rigid care plan to follow. I would say in my own practice, and I've done this work for about 10 years at University of Kentucky HealthCare, there have been occasions that I went in to see a patient with the assumption that we'd be talking about one thing, but a completely different matter came up instead. The patient was pretty much okay with their condition and their treatment, but had had an unexpected loss, say the death of a loved one 6 months before. And so the session, instead of talking about their treatment issues and concerns, talked about their grief. But that was the most important issue for the patient at that time. So narrative medicine has the flexibility to go to the patient's concern instead of insisting, well, this is the thing that we must talk about today. So it's patient-centered, open-ended, and unscripted. The patient in narrative medicine introduces new perspectives, history, and issues, and that can be a continuing process. I've had patients I've spoken with over periods of years, and months into the process, they may introduce new information, new traumas, new to me at least, may surface, be discussed. Partly that's due to a building context of trust and mutual understanding. It also may be that the patient simply can't take it all on at once, and so has to proceed step by step, slowly, as they deal with the trauma that they have faced or the crisis that has been overwhelming for them. And the patient, in a way, sets the pace, sets the timing for how the process of narrative medicine healing may go. So the narrative medicine provider needs flexibility to respond, to allow the patient to explore their memory, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. And those, as for all of us, may not be the same session to session. As the process continues, they may have better days and worse days, and they may have days where they're ready and eager to explore new aspects of their condition, of their history. They may have days that they're less enthusiastic, and that's all part of the process, and the provider just goes with them step by step. Narrative medicine may be distinguished from cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and other related therapies because its focus is on drawing out and integrating the patient's story for wellness, not on confronting or correcting a patient's unhelpful patterns of thoughts and behavior. Those moments may occur occasionally, but that is definitely not the focus. And it's rather a building of trust and a drawing out to draw indeed on the patient's own internal strengths and insights as well, and giving them the opportunity to explore those and claim those without judgment. So there is no script for a narrative medicine session. However, over years of this practice, I've found that occasionally it is helpful to have a basic structure, especially in a first visit. So fundamental questions that I try to keep as simple as possible, like what brings you here? And that is an invitation for the patient to share their complete story of treatment, the presentation of symptoms, the previous attempts for treatment, the current condition, what brings you here? What helps you the most, which again is an invitation for the patient to share their own sources of strength. And that certainly may vary from case to case and situation to situation, patient to patient. So the patient may mention family support, community support. They may mention faith. They may mention other aspects of their life that give them strength and purpose. But to understand what it is that the patient finds most helpful. In other contexts, it may be helpful to aid the patient to connect the dots. In certain cases, there may be opportunities where the patient denies any source of help available, and there really are some there. I remember once talking with a patient, a kind of grumpy patient, who when asked what helps you the most, said nothing. But this was a patient who had a loving family member with them in the room at the time. And it was possible, well, is family a source of support? And they agreed, yes, it is. So sometimes it's possible to connect the dots for the patient, or at least to suggest a possibility. In some cases, that may not be the case, and that's part of the process too, but at least to offer a suggestion. They may have lost the forest for the trees and be taking for granted sources of strength that they've underestimated or overlooked. Another fundamental question, do you see anything differently after the clinical experiences mentioned after the treatment process is unfolded. In many cases, the patient may have come to a very different understanding of themselves, their life. The sociologist Frank talks about narrative or healing in terms of three different kinds of narrative: chaos, restitution, and quest. Chaos would be the initial onset of symptoms of illness or injury, the diagnosis, prognosis that may be very troubling, chaos in the sense that the patient's, the floor may have seemed to drop out from under them, and what seemed to be a stable life may suddenly seem very unstable because of the condition they're facing or the symptoms they've encountered. So that would be a narrative of chaos if they describe that. Restitution would be just obviously to be made whole, to be put back to the status quo ante, what the situation was before the onset of illness or injury. But quest would be, as Dr. Carl Menninger talks about, weller than well, better than well, that sometimes as patients proceed through these processes of healing and change, transformation, growth, they may actually come to places in their lives, places of understanding, differentiation, individuation, integration of life and issues and hopes and abilities that may surpass what they've known before. I've had patients who've experienced this, and toward the end of their treatment, I would ask them, would you like to just go back to where things were before? I said, well, certainly I wouldn't want to face this injury or illness, but I never want to give up the insights that I've gained through this process. I never want to go back to that way of living. I've had patients say, I've spent years of my life just chasing more money, and now I see things differently. I have different values, and I want to act on those. And then finally, what comes next? And this is a question based on the work of Dr. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist in World War II era Austria, who was arrested by the Nazis, put in a concentration camp. But he found, and he had worked with these concepts before, but he found in a very intense and indeed horrible context with fellow prisoners in this men's concentration camp, that those prisoners who had a future orientation, who had a sense of meaning, survived better, survived longer, were less likely to give up or run into the electric wire in despair. And he would actively seek to draw out their sense of meaning. He subsequently published a diary about his experiences, or a record of his experiences, also in conjunction with a section in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, on what he terms logotherapy. But again, drawing out the person's sense of meaning. So in its simplest form, what comes next is an invitation for the patient to share what they find most meaningful. What are they looking for? What do they hope for? What comes next? And it could be something very elaborate, finishing a complex project. It might be as simple as being reunited with loved ones, or returning to a favorite place to see something of significance. So anyway, basic questions for narrative medicine. Narrative medicine is holistic. It locates the patient's illness in the context of their whole life and story. So it's wellness-centered. It's not focused on pathology, although pathology certainly may appear, but is, again, to draw out, based on strength, the patient's insight, self-awareness, and understanding. And again, this dialogue, this dyadic professional relationship can also help the provider and the treatment team to better understand and appreciate the patient's concerns and challenges, their sources, priorities, goals of treatment. So again, the building of a strong bridge between patient and provider or provider team is critical and can be helped in the process of narrative medicine. Narrative medicine, named as such, appeared as a discipline in the late 20th century, and significant work done at Columbia University in the United States and elsewhere. But I just want to say that the therapeutic use of narrative is by no means a late 20th century idea or concept. It has ancient roots, so we can see it in Native American or tribal culture and tradition and elsewhere. Dr. Mel Madrona draws on his own Native American heritage to point out that in his culture, years before, a healer would diagnose the problem through careful listening, rapport building, and the first step of treatment would be to tease out the patient's story. In the late 1920s, Dr. Peabody at Harvard Medical School gave the quotable quote that patient care begins with care for the patient, and that begins with understanding the patient. What makes them tick? What's their work? What are their hopes? What are their dreams? What are their challenges? And all of that is needed to understand the patient and needed to understand, indeed, the causes of what they're facing now in terms of illness and treatment in many cases. So, narrative medicine helps the patient to renegotiate their identity, sense of self, self-awareness in the context of the changing circumstances due to illness or injury. And the Lassignol talks about the biographical disruption of illness, that it may change our own identity necessarily. The prior identity no longer fits, just as, say, for an adult to go back to the school they attended when they were 10 or 12 or 15. I mean, the desks are too small. The prior identity no longer fits. Well, sometimes with illness or injury, the whole situation changes. One's no longer able to drive, no longer able perhaps to be self-sufficient, fully autonomous. So that's a challenge, a biographical challenge, as Lassignol would say. That is a challenge to identity. And as the patient seeks to find a new identity in the context of the changes that they've experienced, narrative medicine can help the patient in their exploration. In the last analysis, it's the patient's identity, not the provider's. So that's always has to be the focus. But just to say, also in a context of recovery for those patients who are not just healed but cured, there's a continuing renegotiation of identity and self-awareness as the patient gets better. Things they had to give up or things that were avoided may be once again faced, once again put in a context of risk and challenge. And that has its own challenges, just as, say, a patient moving from intensive care to a step-down unit to the floor to outpatient care to being released. Every one of those steps reflect an improving condition, but they also are challenges that need to be faced and worked through in terms of renegotiating identity. The patient may discover new insights in the retelling of each story, and with each retelling, there may be a new version. As the saying goes, you can't tell the same story twice. It'll be the same topic, it'll be many of the same details, but each retelling may give an opportunity to put new information, new insights, new perspectives into play. And in inviting the patient to retell their story, the provider, the narrative medicine provider, may hear once again facts, but in a different way, with different details, different insights offered. So to go over an important story on multiple occasions is very appropriate and is warranted. So as I said before, the sessions itself may help the patient face and work through the biographical disruption of illness. Forming a story about life events associated with improved physical and mental health can be seen across a variety of populations. In other words, narrative has had a therapeutic application for all kinds of illnesses and situations. The principles hold true outside of medical concerns. It could be used with, say, individuals who've lost a job. I mean, that's not an illness, but it's a threatening situation, and the narrative in that context could be drawn out and helpfully shared, helping the individual who's raising the concerns to move forward with their life, to begin the next chapter of their life in a helpful way. Pennebaker and others have pointed out that the constructing of stories about a crisis or a difficult situation help the patient to gain a sense of resolution, to move away from chewing on it over and over again, from rumination and conscious thought about troubling experiences. In other words, the forming of narrative may help the patient to let a traumatic or troubling event take its place in their history instead of carrying it forward with them as a kind of lens or prism for every subsequent experience that they may have. Obviously, it's not possible to change the history. I mean, what happened is what happened, but the patient's perception of that, the sense of the meaning of that may change over time. So we can talk about the difference between pain and suffering. There's a context. So painful events may not involve suffering depending on the context. I could talk about, say, when my wife was having kids, it was certainly a painful moment for her physically, but in the context of what was happening, she was bringing new life into the world. She remembers that not as a painful situation, but as a joyful situation, a new birth. And say an athlete might have a pivotal moment, a personal record at best, a significant occasion that did involve pain, but by the same token, because of the context and what that meant, put in a context of meaning, it might be remembered not as painful, but as a triumph, as a joyful moment. Conversely, a situation that didn't involve physical pain might also involve considerable suffering. Back to Viktor Frankl, when he was imprisoned in a work camp by the Nazis, there was one occasion where he'd been given a task like shoveling or something. He had paused just for a moment, and a guard saw him and threw a dirt clod at him. Well, the dirt clod didn't break any bones. It didn't cause a laceration, but he felt demeaned, dehumanized by that moment, by that experience. So it was an occasion of suffering, even though no pain was involved. So what I'm saying about pain and suffering is that narrative exploration for meaning may, in some cases, help the patient to come to a new perspective on their experience that makes the experience less one of suffering and more one perhaps of moving toward meaning or affirming meaning in their case. So I'm going to pause for a moment just to see if there are any questions about narrative medicine basics before going ahead to the second section of this presentation that concerns applications of narrative medicine for patients with functional seizures, also known as psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. Any questions? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to proceed into the second part of this presentation. So, functional seizures, also known as psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, are referred to at times as spells. They resemble epileptic seizures, but that is ultimately ruled out by means of a video EEG, VEEG, which is referred to as a gold standard in separating psychogenic non-epileptic seizures from epileptic seizures. The situation with that is there are many other distinguishing characteristics that may point in that direction as well. A percentage of patients who have epilepsy will also have psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. So the fact that some true epileptic spells have been, or seizures have been documented by VEEG does not rule out the possibility that the patient also experiences functional seizures. And these findings would typically be observed by VEEG in an epilepsy monitoring unit in a hospital, an EMU. So these spells, functional seizures, are involuntary paroxysmal activity of the patient. The spells likely are described other ways that they may be distinguished, oftentimes described in catastrophic terms by the patient. I felt like I was dying. They're very disruptive to the patient's quality of life, independence, sense of personal freedom and dignity. They may have to give up their jobs or not be able to pursue their schooling, unable to drive themselves. They may become dependent on others for transportation. These events may be more likely to occur in public context, including provider examining rooms or waiting rooms. And I add that provider planning is advisable. If the patient is possibly having these events, they may well have them when presenting for care with a provider. These may be misdiagnosed or mistreated as epileptic seizures, and the treatment itself with anti-epilepsy drugs, AED, may cause harm. So that not infrequently what can happen with the non-epileptic seizure is loved ones or friends or strangers may take them to an emergency department, emergency room, where they might then be misdiagnosed as having an epileptic seizure and given an anti-epilepsy drug that makes matters worse and not better. So it's good to have the possibility of FS, PNES in the differential whenever this situation of a seizure is being presented. This is based on a study, and the citations are at the end of this presentation. At a typical epilepsy center, 20 to 40% of the patients diagnosed with epilepsy and seizures were not responding to drugs, misdiagnosed, and most of these had functional seizure, PNES, or more rarely other conditions, syncope or parasomnias. The tragedy of this is in some cases, a very long time may elapse between the first presentation of symptoms of functional seizure, PNES, and accurate diagnosis. Some studies indicate 7 or more years may elapse. And during that time, considerable deterioration of quality of life for the patient who continues to have these episodes without satisfactory explanation. It can be baffling to the patient. Why am I having these episodes? What does it mean? It becomes a very troubling mystery. So functional seizures, PNES, may be described as an orphan disorder, falling between stools, not neurological, if not epileptic, maybe is it psychiatric, is it not? Who is really most responsible for these? And I would answer that ideally a collaborative approach, a team approach can be most effective, where neurology, psychiatry, general medicine, narrative can all work together to help a patient facing these symptoms and these concerns. Functional seizures, or PNS, have been described as a communication disorder, not a language disorder. In other words, the patient with PNES doesn't have aphasia, except perhaps during the time of the episode itself. And frequently, they may be unable to communicate with those around them in the midst of the seizure. But as soon as they come out of that, they're able to speak again and able to talk, but as a communication disorder, that because there's a significant event in their life, maybe in their history or in what they're facing in the future that is overwhelming, they've been unable to put it into words, unwilling to face it. Perhaps they've grown up in a culture where they've been chided for talking about such things. We don't discuss those matters, or greeted with disbelief. The response of that becomes that the body itself may seek to enact a response, a somatic response. Of course, on the one hand, it may serve to divert attention from a topic that the patient desperately seeks to avoid, but at a horrible cost to them in terms of the impact of these pathological symptoms. It really needs to be emphasized that this isn't malingering. It isn't something the patient is choosing. I've spoken with patients, and I've read about others who've been disbelieved by family, friends, even their medical providers. I've spoken with one patient whose physician chided her when she began to have a non-epileptic seizure in his office. He said, "You can't do that in here." Well, she wasn't choosing to. So in any case, that the patient's body takes on a communication of its own, as the patient cannot or will not communicate directly about the unspeakable subject. Family and social expectations may inhibit the patient's expression, and they may also find themselves stigmatized. Even the medical terminology can have that impact. One of the terms I continue to hear used for patients with FS, PNES is pseudo seizures or hysterical seizures. I mean, to me, pseudo means fake, false, or at least suggests that as a possibility. It's not real. Well, it is real. It's just not epileptic. So patients suspected of malingering or faking symptoms may be ostracized or pushed away by their coworkers, family, friends, others in society. And they likewise may feel very self-conscious. They may become afraid to go out into public lest one of these episodes overtake them. As I said before, some clinicians have verbally disparaged their patients having those symptoms in their presence. So functional seizures, PNES, may be may take the form of a threat avoidant behavior, avoiding family conflict, diverting attention away from the real core issue that's at stake. And so it's not unusual to find patients with very difficult family histories, patients who've been subjected to abuse in the context of their family, be that sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. The patients may be enmeshed in a too close family dynamic that may complicate treatment. In some cases, family members may seek to, quote, protect the patient from inquiries about the subjects that are troubling to them. And yet that's the very worst thing for them to do under that circumstance. It prevents the patient's healing. It prevents the patient from moving forward. The patient's anguish may be more than the heart can bear. The brain may step in and provide its own defense or diversion, but again, at a horrible cost to the lifestyle of the patient. So the unspeakable trauma or stress may be temporarily avoided, but at a great cost. The functional seizure, PNS, may reflect the repression of unacceptable emotion or may be dissociative from a distressing experience. The symptoms may serve as a warning signal to the patient and provider concerning present stress. One thing to say is, even as patients may well and frequently do improve as they go through a process of treatment with narrative medicine, but they will still be somaticizers, so that on occasion they may yet in the future face other stressful events that they face in life, and they may recognize that symptoms are arising. And just to say that this actually can serve a purpose as a warning signal that something's going on in the life of the patient at that point. Something is becoming more stressful than they may even acknowledge. And I would say that the patients with this condition, sort of the alexithymia, they may tend to be unaware of their emotional state or their feeling state, may be disassociated from or prone to being disassociated from their feeling state. And that's another part of the challenge and the opportunity for healing during the course of narrative therapy, during the course of narrative medicine sessions. Until the treatment is gone forward, the patient may hold unbearable pain inside. And so this is a very important process that can be life-changing. When the patient begins to see connections between their past trauma and the symptoms they experience, that may be an occasion of great relief after years of not knowing why these symptoms would arise or in what context they might arise. They may begin to see answers. They may begin to see a better explanation, and just understanding that dynamic itself may be part of the healing. So functional seizure, PNES, may result from exposure to traumatic experience with PTSD as a comorbidity. It may result from physical or psychological trauma, sexual, physical, or emotional in nature, and it may result also from overwhelming stress, even anticipated overwhelming stress, what's referred to as developmental functional seizures, or PNES, difficulty with tasks or milestones along the continuum of psychosocial development. So as one approaches a major turning point in life, whether that be going off to college or leaving home for other forms of work experience, or the loss of a loved one, the loss of employment that may be looming, that might be developmental in the sense that the trauma hasn't yet occurred, but it's predictable and approaching, and that might prove to be overwhelming for a patient in these terms. So that's an overview of the condition of functional seizure or psychogenic non-epileptic seizure. And again, I'll allow time for any questions before proceeding to a single case study that illustrates these principles and practices. Any questions? Okay. So in this case study, this is a patient that I saw a few years ago now. She had been sexually abused as a child by a much older relative. Indeed, her earliest memory was of being abused by this much older person, and indeed had been warned to keep silent, had seemed happy as a youth, but in fact was very much afraid. But she continued a pattern of silence and avoidance of this feeling as an adult. She had an onset of functional seizure, psychogenic non-epileptic seizure in her 20s. As mentioned before, she understood these episodes in catastrophic terms. She felt like she was dying. She would whisk off to the emergency department, had many ER visits in these episodes. On one occasion, she had as many as 10 of these episodes in one day. The frequent provider episodes, frequent ER visits made itself a cause of stress for her, family stress around taking her. It was something of a drive to get to the hospital. And yet, after going there, the treatments, diagnoses, things seemed to be inconclusive, didn't really prevent the next one from happening. Issues were unresolved, and no one thought of the possibility of a non-epileptic seizure or cause of the symptoms that were observed. The patient's first episode took place when she was in a shower, and during the unfolding story of her abuse, it was revealed that her first occasion of abuse took place in a home bathroom. So she was in the same kind of room. Another triggering event for the patient, she experienced, like on one occasion, a medical test that involved her being in a room by herself on her back in the dark, and then the tech closing the door on the way out, and all of those related to events in her own abuse history. As the narrative medicine process continued, her symptoms diminished. Although I have to say, initially, she acknowledged the abuse, the sexual abuse history, but said, this has been worked out. I've talked through, I've worked with people in the past. But as the narrative medicine process continued, the themes continued to seem to kind of point back to this. And eventually there was a turning point in which she said, no, I think I haven't worked through all of this. This was actually precipitated after there'd been a prescription of an anti-epilepsy drug that, instead of making it better for her, leading to improvement, actually made things much worse. And she began to have suicidal ideation, which she had not before. She was quickly taken off the anti-epilepsy drug, and that resolved. But also out of that, she came away with renewed willingness to explore her traumatic narrative. And as she did, her condition improved, her episodes became less frequent, and she became more able to engage her life on her own terms. So the patient constructing a written and oral story about a personal trauma can discover the narrative antidote of a communication therapy for the communication disorder of functional seizure, psychogenic non-epileptic seizure. The patient may discover hope in putting the unspeakable into words. As the process continues, patients with functional seizure PNES can tell the stories of their traumas, and in some occasions, it may be the first time they've been able to do so. They may find themselves able to disclose their patterns of avoidance, recurring nightmares that may point back to their trauma, details of circumstances that they had not previously mentioned or even themselves thought of in years, allowing them to construct a coherent narrative that helps them to let that take its place in the past instead of continuing to impact their life in the present as a source of additional stress. Especially these events may come up around times like an anniversary of an event, or the patient may experience events in the world that remind them, maybe a person that reminds them of their abuser, a scent of, say, an aftershave or perfume that reminds of a previous occasion. But as they come to terms with what's happened, these reminders may be much less stressful or much less of a trigger as they go forward. The patient may, as they get closer to the heart of the matter, become increasingly symptomatic. I've had patients as we had a fairly neutral conversation, and then the conversation turned toward their abuse, of their central issue of concern. They might become symptomatic there, ask questions like, is it getting hot in this room? Or begin to show slight tremors. Even I've on one occasion seen a full-blown episode to occur. But conversely, as they begin to work through these issues, they may have fewer episodes, fewer symptoms, come to greater sense of wholeness and healing around the causes of their condition. They can become, if you will, unstuck from something that's kept them stuck in a past trauma or past difficulty for many years. As I say, just the awareness of the connection between their symptoms and the causes of them may itself be therapeutic. Bassett reported a remission rate of almost 40% at 6 to 12 months with that knowledge. Those results may vary, but just to say it's important for the patient to begin to see where does this come from and what may trigger it. And that in itself may help them to manage the episodes. I've had patients report that with this understanding, they can feel an episode coming on and can help to prevent it from developing further. The reduction in patient healthcare use after presentation of the diagnosis has also been documented. Fewer visits to providers, fewer visits to emergency rooms. That was certainly the situation in the case study that I offered. They may notice less frequent spells or less intense spells after accepting the diagnosis of functional seizure, psychogenic non-epileptic seizure. That will be easier for them to do if family members, others are accepting and supportive instead of denying the condition or criticizing the patient for having the condition. The patients may be surprised by the not coincidence of the connection between the symptoms and trauma or stress, and relieved when they understand the condition and symptoms better. The therapeutic use of narrative encourages improved patient communication and self-understanding. The improvements of the patient's overall life situation and strategies for stress management may also relieve the patient's sense of being overwhelmed and contribute to an improvement in symptoms. The narrative medicine therapy helps patients with functional seizure, PNES, to engage the traumas and life issues they cannot avoid without debilitating consequences. They can begin a process of communication and self-reflection that continues beyond the narrative medicine sessions, and they may apply the methods they learn in those sessions for their own day-to-day use. The patients can discover new perspectives and insights to reframe their understanding of past traumatic events. They can continue, as we mentioned before in the discussion of narrative medicine generally, to renegotiate self-identity, their own sense of self with new hope, leading to improved resilience and quality of life. These sessions encourage patients to communicate more effectively about their unspeakable traumas or overwhelming concerns and to reclaim their lives from the communication disorder of functional seizure, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. And here are my references that I believe are also available in the conference materials.